Hey guys, welcome to another episode of the Pillowtalk Podcast. And this week we have a really special podcast planned for you. And during this whole lockdown, we finally got time to sit with our grandparents, our parents, without any hurry, without any hassle, just us sitting and talking. And the one thing that we talked to our grandparents about was about their experience of the partition, right? And this time it was without any hurry, and my Dadu sat down to explain the whole series of events, how he had to flee overnight from Pakistan, how he had to take help from a lot of his Muslim friends who actually helped him be alive today, and how he had to flee from Lahore to a very small town in Maharashtra called Bhusawal overnight. And similarly, Jay has a lot of these stories from his grandparents that we talked about. And while talking about these stories, we thought about how this is possibly the last generation that has the first hand accounts of the partition and how these have to be completely immortalized. So today on this episode, we have someone who's done this to a great extent. They've been working very closely with partition refugees from 1947. Their aim is to reconnect partition refugees to their childhood homes and communities. And they do that in a very interesting manner. They use virtual reality technology across India and Pakistan, and they've connected like a ton of refugees to their old childhood homes. We have with us the co-founder of Project Dastaan, Sparsh Ahuja, and the Bengal lead of Project Dastaan is Jayosmita Ganguly. Welcome, guys. Could you please tell us a little bit about yourselves and about Project Dastaan in your own words?
So, hey everyone, my name is Sparsh. As Manan mentioned, I'm one of the co-founders of Project Dastaan. So, I grew up in between Delhi and Melbourne, Australia. I come from a partition family, so both my grandfathers were migrants from West Punjab, um, and they migrated to coincidentally within a 5 minute walking distance of each other in Tilak Nagar in
Oh,
Delhi. So I've been hearing partition stories since I was a little kid. It's kind of the starting point of my family history. We don't really have many records that go before then, so partition is like what is seen as like the starting point for my family. Um, so I mean, one of the things uh, what always touched me when I was hearing at least my Nanu stories was this idea that um, he he used to dream about his ancestral village. He sits in like his room in Delhi and he scribbles in Urdu in his diary. So there's a lot of
hmm,
things that remind him of what home used to be for him.
yeah.
Um, that's not just the story of him, but it's the story of Delhi itself. Like if you look at demographic change in that city, um, it's like the original a lot of the original families that were from Delhi are now in Karachi, and Delhi today is like it's basically a Punjabi city. So
Yeah.
um this is quite a common story in the area I grew up in. So I thought, what would be really cool is if we could take him back across the border and show him. But obviously the situation is quite tough.
Yeah.
Um, and he's quite elderly as well, so going back to Pakistan wasn't going to be a likely possibility. Um,
Hmm.
and well, I was studying in university at the time, and I met a friend. I met a few friends who also had family links to the partition, and we came up with this idea that why can't we use virtual reality to take these people back? And it started off as just like a a fanciful student idea. Um,
Yeah.
People come up with very crazy stuff all the time,
Yeah.
but we decided to apply to a few grants, and for about like a year, nothing happened. And then suddenly, I woke up one morning and I had an email from NGO in San Francisco called the Catchlight Foundation,
Yeah.
and said, "Look, you have $30,000 to go do your project." Wow, fantastic. This is great. And so from there, it's just been kind of catapulting. So, yeah, we'll speak more about where the project has gone since then as we go along.
Like even I come from like a partition background, but not the Punjab like Punjab, Pakistan side, but the
Yeah.
eastern side, Bangladesh and Calcutta
Uh,
type.
yeah,
And
yeah.
more than listening about these stories, I always saw, like, my grandfather, my nana, he's a painter, okay, he's an artist, right? And he
Hmm.
had these like really vivid landscapes. He loves drawing landscapes, okay? And those landscapes, for some reason, do not adhere quite much to what we see.
Mhm.
Okay.
Okay, and then like it
Hmm.
was even more evident while taking the interview as to how he got the like what is his background of drawing those landscapes, which is basically his childhood home. Like it's Jamalpur, right? So
Mhm.
All
Jamalpur
right.
in present day
Hmm.
Bangladesh. And
Yeah.
apart from that, like it's not just listening to these tales, but also so there is this one thing called Bangal tone and Ghoti tone in the Bangla language and like people. So Bangals are the people who came from the other side of the border to West Bengal, and
Yeah.
all of us always had that tone. So like that is the partition background for us.
Yeah.
So, how did you both meet? Like, how did you both meet and like start working on Project Dastan? Especially for you, Jayosmita, what intrigued you about Project Dastan and attracted you towards this whole idea?
Okay, so the thing is, a I am really interested in the entire idea of partition, and the fact that I got introduced to partition, like what partition was and all of that, not in school because I mean, we don't have that much in textbooks. But in like second year of my literature studies, where I had partition literature in full blown, and I'm like, okay, this is something nobody talks about, and that's when we got into
Yeah.
reading Urvashi Bhutalia and all of that. Now,
Yeah.
like these people, like Project Dastan has always been like super active on Instagram, right? So I
Mhm.
would just like sit and stalk the pages, okay? And
Yeah.
I'm like, hey, this is like really cool. So yeah, okay, this might sound really creepy, but I spammed Sam when I wanted to like join in. And
Yeah.
yeah, I just was like, I really want to work for this project. It's so cool. It's like amazing stuff what they do. And like some people who are actually working for doing something about partition, like healing the trauma and something which we learn in textbooks, and these people were doing it practically. So that was pretty cool. Yay.
Right. Right.
Yeah, and like both of you mentioned, I think what's the only thing that is very homogeneous with this group of us is that all of us come from partition backgrounds. So, like Sparsh mentioned, even I have my grandparents, mostly my grandfathers, who had to flee from Pakistan during the partition. And I've heard stories that when they're narrating those stories to me, even now I still have goosebumps hearing them, right? And that is when I'm just hearing about what happened. Like, I wasn't there, I didn't see anything. They were the ones who were to run with nothing but their family members to make sure that all of them are actually able to come to the other side of the border alive and well. So, one thing that I want to ask before we get into a discussion about how things are on both sides of the border. This is a question to Sparsh, Jayasmita, both of you. What was the idea that you had behind this, and how did that idea turn into this project, and how has that project been executed over the years that this has been in place? Like, what made you do this? How did you come up with the concept of virtual reality, and how has that been implemented over the years? How have you come in contact with certain people who wanted to revisit their childhood homes and all of that?
Okay, yeah. So, I mean, as I said previously, we were four friends. It started with four friends. We were all studying at Oxford in England at the time. Um, and we all come from partition families, just like this group. Um, and so we started discussing, just sharing our grandparents' stories, and yeah, and talking about the family, the legacies that partition held in our families. From there, the idea, like virtual reality, was always seen as like a means to an end. So none of us really come
Mm-hmm.
from technical backgrounds. But the cool thing about virtual reality, especially 360 video, is you don't need to be incredibly technically proficient to film a good 360 video. Um,
That's quite surprising, actually.
yeah, so we'll go into this later, but there's two kinds of VR that
All right.
in common
Mm-hmm.
language, there's two kinds of virtual reality that the project uses, and one of them requires quite a big technical barrier, but the second is quite accessible to anyone with the GoPro. So just filming a 360 video that someone can sit and look around using like a
Yeah,
normal
yeah.
headset or a cardboard is just like shooting a
Mm-hmm.
video, except you shoot it from every different angle. And we thought, this is the closest we can get to taking people back without physically taking them back. Um,
Yeah.
Yes.
and it obviously caught a lot of interest because there's been people who've sent photos across the border, but I think the idea that
Mm-hmm.
someone could be like immersed back into that environment was quite special. So it did get us a bunch of early attention from people who might be interested in supporting us. Um, and then we started recording stories by, well, first we recorded our grandparents' stories, then we recorded our friends' grandparents, and then it's kind of, as Jayo said, like our Instagram is quite active, so we'll get a lot of people sending in inquiries saying,
Request.
"Can you
Yeah.
do so and so?" And so yeah, it's just kind of grown organically. Um, there wasn't at the start there wasn't really a plan. We, we didn't really expect it and it was a little haphazard because we didn't really know what we were doing. But then through speaking to people like Anshul Malhotra or Anam Zakaria, some of these authors working in this field, we've come to have a standardized process and treat these stories with the respect that they deserve.
Mm. So I think before we dive deep into Project Dastan and the small aspects of it, I really want to like a lot of your team has been to both India and Pakistan, right? So just like slightly out of curiosity, what is the similarity or like the difference between the narrative that both the states have with respect to the partition?
I mean, Jayo and I, none of us have been to Pakistan. I guess the really sad thing was just before coronavirus started, I was about to go like in a couple weeks time, but then yeah, and then obviously we couldn't travel now.
Yeah,
It was sad, but it will happen one day. I have been to Bangladesh.
yeah,
That was super nice. But in terms of like talking about different narratives, one of the really good authors in this field is Anam Zakaria, who worked uh, primarily in Pakistani Kashmir, like recording
hmm,
oral histories from that region. And so she's done a bunch of research into the way that the interpretation of partition and the legacy of partition differs across India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. So I'll let Jayo speak to Bangladesh, but in terms of India and Pakistan, in India there's this kind of the nationalism is like it might be changing a little bit now due to the current politics, but up until maybe 2014, 2015, the kind of primary idea carried forward about the partition is the one is like the same ideals of the Congress Party in the 1940s. So um,
Mm-hmm.
this was one existing entity. It was because of British divide and rule policies that the nation was split, and it's seen as kind of like a regrettable incident. Yeah, I think that's like the Indian nationalist view of the partition, and I'm generalizing here. There's a lot of like sub stratification of these views. Um,
right.
in Pakistan, if I were to generalize, it's not just independence from the British, but also independence from the threat of Hindu persecution,
Right.
which is what they feel. And obviously, I don't want to speak on behalf of Pakistani Voice. It would have been great to get Sadia here to speak to that narrative. But yeah, from Anand's work, it's seen as a dual freedom, not just from
Yeah.
colonialism, but from like Hindu majoritarianism as well, which is not something that's reflected in the Indian side of the narrative.
Yeah, so the thing is, one of the one like it. How do I explain it? So one common doubt I would always have is I would ask these friends of mine whose grandparents also moved. and they'd be like, hey, listen, they moved sometime around the 1950s and 60s. Is that okay? Now, that's the thing with Bengal partition, right? It happened twice. It happened once in 47, once in 71. So
Yeah.
it
Yeah.
like the narrative then becomes quite complex as to what partition are we talking about and how are we covering it. Although by far we have been
Hmm.
able to cover like five stories from Bengal, but the differences in voices, of course, like gender voices have been quite different. And secondly, it's like even when we were taking in more interviews, like we were just registering them, there was always this discrepancy of the year. Like, does a 1950 partition still count, like mid
Right.
1950s still count as
Yeah.
1947?
Yeah.
And
Right.
all of that, and that has still been there. Like, I know for a fact, one of my friends who was like really keen on getting his grandfather interviewed, and like I was supposed to put it on the story tracker right before the COVID thing, but the thing is, all of then, like, he's like, oh, but he came sometime around the 1960s, like early 1960s. Does that still count? So this is the problem
Hmm.
with Bengal partition in narrative. Like, which partition are we talking about? And that has
Right.
been multiple, and it's still like prevalent, the issues. So yeah.
Yeah, and also, I feel that to a very large extent, the Bengal partition has been excluded from, say, inclusion in the mainstream discourse about how there has been so much movement, how there has been so much, so much that has happened on both sides of the border. Pakistan, we've talked about a lot. I think Bengal, on the other hand,
Exactly.
and Bangladesh, on the other hand, is not. Yeah.
Yeah. Currently, it's like these three sides of border, right? Like there are three borders we are dealing with.
Exactly.
So
Yeah.
it does
Hmm.
become an issue that way.
Yeah, and so like Sparsh also mentioned that there are so many authors and there are so many people who've done a lot of work trying to cover both sides of the story. And similarly, I was recently going through this speech that was made in the mid 1800s. Like that's a long time back. By it was made by Sir Syed Ahmad Khan. So he was one of the most influential speakers in the Mohammedan community at that time, and he spoke to a very large extent about how the Muslims need to emancipate themselves, not just from the British, not just from the the Hindu majority, but also from the fact that they need to bring their community up with respect to a lot of other things, say education, employment, so on and so forth. So all of this has trickled down to a point where obviously communities on both sides of the border, be it the border from Pakistan or the border from Bangladesh, there are communities which harbor certain sentiments and certain feelings about everything that transpired, during during everything that happened. So, like, this is again something that I would want to know both from Sparsh and Jayosmita is that when you are canvassing areas, to make the videos for the VR experience, when you're talking to people who are local residents of Bangladesh or Pakistan, are there any apprehensions that the local communities, make evident? Are there things that they are not comfortable with, or and how have you, convinced them? How have you explained to them what you are doing with Project Dastaan?
I mean, it's a politically sensitive matter, because it continues to affect current politics around citizenship today. So obviously, there is more hesitance talking about this topic than, say I was to talk about how they feel about local government. People are much more willing to open up about that. But you ask how their grandparents felt 70 years ago, and suddenly they'll go quiet. And I think a lot of that is because of not only political development since the partition, but because of the scale of the trauma that people went through. Like, it's something that they felt the need to bury, simply because, like, some of the events that happened were just so horrible and so shameful that you don't want to think about it. Especially for first hand survivors. Now, we will only interview someone who's comfortable being interviewed. If someone doesn't want to talk about that part of their past, then our job isn't to re-traumatize them. So
Right.
we'll,
Yeah, yeah.
we'll only when we're out there, we'll ask people if they want to speak about either their family history, or if it's a first-hand survivor, obviously what their migration journey was like and what their house was like, etc. But it's not something that uh, it's a consent thing at the end of the day. So if they want to speak about it, they want to speak about it. If not, then we just politely move on. So that's when it comes to interviewing people about their experience. And you'll see regional differences, as you said, like each community has its own distinct collective memory. Um, so
Mm-hmm.
that's one of the tricky things with oral history in this manner is that um, communities tend to take on like a collective identity and a collective loss.
Right.
So you'll
Yeah,
in a
yeah.
similar area of Delhi will tell a similar story, and to an extent
Hmm.
you'll question whether all of them were there to see that specific incident of this man being, like chopped apart at a train station. Now, like obviously that
Yeah.
happened, but did it happen to that particular person we interviewed? We don't know for sure, right?
Hmm.
So that's
Yeah.
kind of briefly what difficulties we face when we're interviewing people. On the other hand, when we're going to track down people's locations and like we're on the other side of the border, so to speak, trying to find their old memories, the communities that live in these towns today are like incredibly helpful. Like the moment they hear that someone on the
Okay.
other side is
Mm-hmm.
wanting to see their old home again, it's
Hmm.
it's like our local volunteers there become like celebrities, and everyone comes over to come have chai or like here, let me give you a little tour of this village, or I miss
Yeah, that's
you,
amazing.
like people are that sense
Hmm.
people are very kind, and a lot of them will actually like want to leave like messages for the person who came to our village. In a few of our stories, we even managed to reconnect old friends. So um,
Oh
on that
wow.
side, it's very heartwarming, and it just kind of reminds us why we started this project in the first place. So that's what I say.
Also about like finding stories in the interviews. Like right now, when we were trying to look up stories from the Northeast, that is one
Hmm.
area which has been like highly marginalized in politics and otherwise. So like
Yeah,
getting
yeah.
stories from that area, and that's like a very sensitive area, right? So getting stories from that area
Hmm.
is kind of difficult, then people may or may not be willing to talk about it. So that area is again like kind of difficult to get stories from. So there are these certain cases where it becomes difficult to get stories from. So yeah.
Hmm. Also, another thing that I was really intrigued about, like I have two questions which are coming to my head right now. One being like, so you both know about how the CA NRC thing took place in India a while back, and how there was a major uprising in the country. While that was happening, we saw like a very different sort of side of Hindu Hindu nationalism, if I can say, like in their words, where people just became intolerant towards the other religion, majorly being Muslims, and that's something I really want to know is it might be political, but if you can answer how are religious minorities being treated differently in India and Pakistan, or even in Bangladesh,
I mean, this might be a little outside the scope of what we do. Um, I mean,
but like from your experiences.
as in, as I said, like this is a kind of question that only someone who's lived in that country can
Hmm.
really speak to, and like especially if you are a religious minority, like the last thing I want to do is speak on behalf of like someone's oppression when I haven't felt that oppression.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah. That's
So,
right.
like, I mean, briefly, what I can say is like the like religious minorities in India, especially over the last 6 years, like the situation has rapidly deteriorated,
Right. Right.
and there's no hiding it. As much as this, as much as the PR spin of this present government might be, they're like all kind of most of the major civic liberty indicators, such as Freedom House or Human Rights Watch or Amnesty, have reported like a sharp increase in hate crimes against minority communities. And this could
Hmm.
be not just Muslims, but transgender, lower caste, um, Yeah, it's that's without a doubt. In terms of Pakistan and Bangladesh, um, look, yeah, in Pakistan at the moment, there's a lot of if like quite recently there was a lot of commotion over the creation of the Hindu temple in Islamabad.
Right.
Um,
Yeah.
the minority Imran Khan's minority commission has like failed to deal with the Ahmadi situation again
Hmm.
after repeated protests. So on paper, the minority situation in Pakistan might like the government might not be outwardly religious, but in practice, minorities continue to be marginalized, especially Hindus and Shias, let alone the Ahmadis, who are basically second class citizens.
Right.
Um,
Hmm.
in Bangladesh, I wouldn't know. Jayasmita?
No, the thing is, like, just like Sparsh said, I wouldn't be in a perfect position to talk about it because I haven't really experienced it. I haven't even been to Bangladesh. So, while yes, religious oppression do take place, at least I am not the, like, I do not want to do like a, I don't know, religious planning.
All right. So I think other than that, what this CA NRC whole thing, like while this whole thing was unfolding, we saw like a lot of very traumatic stories. Again, very similar to those of partition, where people literally had to flee their homes overnight just to ensure the safety for them and their families. But what I also realized was after some time, there was a sort of disconnect from this whole situation. Like, even though I was listening to those stories, they didn't have the same emotional or the physical impact they had on me earlier. So, this is something that I want to ask you, Sparsh, especially, is when you've heard like a lot of, like, let's say, you've heard stories upwards of 100, I'm assuming. So, how have you not lost that sort of connect to the whole situation?
I don't know. Yeah, okay, look, information desensitization is definitely a thing, but it's not something limited to partition stories. Like, I don't,
Hmm.
especially remember like the early days of this pandemic, like every day everyone would be checking the numbers. And it'd be,
Exactly.
Yeah.
and now you hear like 90,000 cases a day, and you're like, oh, whatever. It's fake news. So that's not something that's kind of specific to this project. I think that's just any kind of journalistic work. You have to develop a little bit of a thick skin to be able to continue to do the work. That being said, like if you're hearing, I think it's different reading it on paper compared to actually being there interviewing someone.
Yeah. Yeah. That's
When
right.
you have traumatic, when you do listen to a lot of traumatic memories, you start to not well, I mean, secondhand traumatization is something that's talked about a lot with journalists.
Hmm.
Um, I mean, like some of us experienced it very briefly when we were hearing stories of. There's one interview we did in Kolkata. Jayosmita was there as well, where he was a professor at Dhaka University, and he was recounting how uh, when the riots broke out in Dhaka, he saw people like pouring sugar syrup, like rus from ras malai, like onto each other. Obviously, like hot sugar syrup, so they're being like burnt alive. And that kind of stuff, like like I don't think there's anyone who'd be desensitized to that if you're,
Yeah, I
you're
mean,
hearing that.
hearing that is giving me goosebumps right
Yeah,
now.
if you're
And I
hearing that,
think it'll still give me the same goosebumps 10 years down the line.
exactly. So like
Yeah.
if you want to keep doing this work, you've got to find a way to like put that out of your head at some point because you can get lost in that really easily just thinking about like all of the stuff that happened. Anshul writes about this a lot about facing the weight of these stories. So she has been really helpful when we've been through.
And so like you mentioned that there's a lot of second-hand trauma that's involved while you're covering so many of these stories. So when I was talking to my parents about how we are having the team members from Project Dastaan over for a podcast, so like my father, he's heard stories about partition from my grandfather for as long as he can remember, right? So one thing that I've noticed is that my parents and parents who have had so basically, like our parents who've heard stories from our grandparents about partition, they also have a very, very strong emotional connect, right? Even my grandparents, most of the times whenever I'm talking to them about the partition, they do end up tearing up a little bit, every time they narrate the story to me. One thing that I wanted to ask you is that when you're covering these stories, when you're making the videos for the VR experience for anyone that you're helping out, are there any, since obviously it brings up a lot of happy memories, but are there any traumatic memories that are, involved, that come up, not just for the person who, is being taken back to their childhood homes, but for their family members, say their kids, their wives, and even themselves? Like, how do you deal with the potential trauma that they might go through when they are, transported back, even in a virtual aspect, back to their childhood home?
A lot of this is about process. So we have our questions vetted by some experts in the area. We have an advisory board with some of the like foremost scholars working on this area of partition studies. So we do make sure that we're doing things in like a systematic and correct manner to prevent this as much as possible. We can't obviously prevent someone breaking down. Like it happens,
Yeah.
sometimes. So one of the one such experience we had was we had filmed a bunch of stories for a family in London who came from Ropar and Nalagarh in Punjab. Um, and of that family, four people took it really well. They loved it, and the eldest man in that family thought that I don't want to see this again. Like, why are you showing this to me?
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
That is something obviously that hurt because to see that man having so much trauma over a piece of land that the place that he was born in is obviously like hard. Um, but again, it's like it's little by little. It's like the same thing as I said about when we interview someone. You don't push their boundaries. It's about consent. So if he doesn't want to see that video, he doesn't want to see that video, and you don't push something like that on a participant.
Of course, yeah, yeah.
What
That
we
makes
did do,
sense.
what we did do in that situation is, luckily, that was one of the stories where we could reconnect him to one of his old friends, and he loved that. So there's
Yeah.
always a silver lining,
Yeah.
and the
Yeah.
rest of his family who had never seen like the place they were from, they loved that experience. So that's
Amazing.
the re-traumatization question.
I know every story has something special, has a different aspect to it. But could you tell us about one of those stories that just stood out to you where it became extremely emotional for like the whole group of people who were there? And what was something that you actually like learned from that experience?
Wait. There are like so many stories, but I
I know,
think
I
one.
know.
There are like so many stories. I'm actually trying to recall which one. Like, of course, like despite not having interviewed, like of course, of my having interviewed, definitely, like my grandfather and this the professor Sparsh just spoke about. No,
Yeah,
but there are like
yeah,
such amazing bits from like so many interviews. Like there's this one uncle who sits all day long with photographs, right? Like the professor, he checks Dhaka photographs every day. Then there is this another uncle who keeps on like he is so annoyed by the entire system. He's like, what is happening? Okay,
hmm,
and we did not do partition and all of that. Okay, but I think the best one still goes to Saida Siddiqui. Like
yeah,
she's practically the poster girl for Project Dastaan, like in a very
yeah.
adorable way, like not in a creepy way. Yeah. So like it's literally adorable, and even like when Sparsh and Sam went and they had reconnected this pandit from her locality, and then they were doing this telephonic conversation, and it was really adorable, this kind of short banter they were having.
Saida is this woman from Lucknow who migrated to Karachi sometime in the mid 50s. So she remembered her like apartment, sorry, not her apartment block, her house. And when we went and visited that street, that house had been torn down and converted into a series of like modern apartment buildings. So we were like really sad because we thought, what are we going to show in ours? This is going to be depressing for her, Like she was like, oh, there used to be so many nice gardens here, and instead there's like a panwala and a bunch of modern apartments. This isn't going right. But then we looked across the street. And there's a mandir there, and we remembered that she said, "Oh, there's a mandir opposite my street." And we thought, you know what? Let's check if this is the same place. So we walk in, and this old man comes out, and he's like, "Who are you guys? Why are you here?" Like, I don't think this mandir gets many like filmmaking crews walking. So we explained that 50, 60 years back, there used to be a family called the Siddiquis who lived across the street. And he's like, oh, I know Faida. Like, we used to know each other. And so we're like, that's crazy. Like, get on a phone call. And we recorded that phone call. And they obviously had like played with each other as kids. And they were talking about making plans of visiting each other again and recounting old stories of that area. So that was definitely like a really nice moment.
You know what?
I can send you guys the video of that afterwards.
What stands out for me from this whole story is that having a mandir in this country has so many benefits. It has so many benefits.
Oh my god.
Like having a mandir, spot on. We have it. Like so many benefits we can reap from that. Also, other than that, I think Project Dastan has two wonderful projects: Child of Empire and The Lost Migration. Could you tell us a little bit more about those projects as well?
Yeah, so Child of Empire is a virtual reality animated documentary. So the normal experiences we do are just kind of 360 videos of the towns that these places the people came from, and we show it back to them, right? And as I said earlier, VR has two components. There's 360 video, and then there's what we call true VR. And true VR is not just where you can look around from one vantage point, but where you can interact with objects, you can walk in and out of different spaces, you can talk to people. So that's what we call six depths of field, sixed off. So Child of Empire is built in sixed off. It's an animated experience of what the migration would have been like from the perspective of the migrant as a child. So you're kind of going through the experience with the migrant. So you'll go through, like a village and riot and like a train being massacred and a refugee camp. And you'll see the speech in front of the Red Fort in virtual reality. We're recreating it in animation. So that's meant to be like generating empathy for the migrants, especially outside of India and Pakistan, where people might not have heard the story. It's kind of something we want to take out to schools and museums. So Child of Empire is like, it's been really exciting working on that. We recently presented at the Venice Film Festival last week, and we're currently working with England's Arts Council to build a prototype, which should be ready in a few weeks. So that's going ahead really great. The Lost Migration is a project run by a filmmaker in New York called Shabano. And what she wants to do is physically take her grandfather back to Lucknow, and he's also in Karachi. So that's like more like a feature film, where she'll fly him out there if he gets the visa. Fingers crossed. So
Yeah.
yeah,
Can we start a petition for that?
yeah, sure. I'm sure she'll appreciate it.
Yeah, perfect.
Yeah, and so like you mentioned, there are two more projects that Project Dastan is going to come out with. So there are two questions that I actually have. Now that we have a fair idea of how the entire process and how the algorithm works. So like this is again a question to both of you. Is that from a very personal standpoint, what like obviously from a personal standpoint and from a collective standpoint, what is the goal that you would want to achieve with Project Dastan, and what is the legacy that you would want Project Dastan to be remembered by?
Like personally, I'd want anyone who goes through this experience to kind of recognize that yes, communities might have inflicted trauma on each other, but like everyone suffered a degree of trauma. So harboring resentment for things that happened 70 years ago from everyone, it happened to everyone. It wasn't like it was just Muslims who inflicted violence on Hindus, or it was just Hindus that inflicted violence on Muslims, or that it was only Sikhs who, like, you know what I mean? Like, this happened to everyone. And
Yeah, yeah.
just by showing that experience being really similar, we're hoping to kind of put the current political wounds back into context. That if we recognize that this wasn't the fault of one particular community, it depends on which side of the border, which community that is that you're blaming. Um, Perhaps we wouldn't have that kind of animosity now.
Yeah.
That's my personal goal. Um, and everyone on the project sees it differently. So I'd love
To
Jayo to
look at
hear.
it, I just want, like, it's basically this trauma to be healed, right? Like, if that much is done, it's sufficient at this moment. Like, just the healing way. That is highly important. Like, from a very psychological as well as from a collective.
So how had like COVID affected your progress and like your final goal of Project Dastaan?
Obviously, we can't film right now. So
Yeah.
all of the social impact return projects are off until travel is back on. Which was kind of sad because we had just won a grant from National Geographic to be traveling all of this year. So yeah, a lot of travel planned for this year, but it's fine. Um, uh, so that will continue after the pandemic finishes. In the meantime, we're doing two. Obviously, Child of Empire is continuing as it is, and we're making this new animated series, which are just it's a series of mini animated episodes that focus on partition from angles that are popularly unexplored. So things like the role of women during the partition, or the Northeast, or the way partition affected Dalit communities. So we're really looking at
Hmm.
subaltern voices and trying to bring out things that the mainstream narrative of like Punjab being torn apart doesn't reflect.
Hmm. So, all right, the last question to conclude the podcast for both of you, Sparsh and Jayo. How would you personally want to be remembered?
Okay, I haven't thought about
What is this existential question at 12 o'clock in the morning?
No, but no, honestly, no. But like both of you at 22, you've done so much. Like you've done so much already, and there's a very, very long way to go for both of you. So just till now, till like 22 years of age, how would you want to be remembered?
Yeah, I actually don't know what to say. Like, that's such a. I've never really thought about that.
Do you want to
Yeah,
probably
Uh,
write a book or something about this whole experience or what?
I mean, Sam's writing a book now about the partition, so that's really exciting. He'll be working on that. I'm starting a job in London next year, so which I'm super excited about as well. We're all kind of going into different things. Um,
Mhm.
I don't know. Maybe I think I might think about this question. I really don't know. Jamal?
I mean, I don't think I am that into being remembered. I just want to do these things because these are like fun and like these are nice stuff to do, right? More than getting remembered or something.
Yeah, just one more thing that I would want to add before we move to the end is that if there are any friends of ours who want their grandparents, who want their family members to get involved with everything that Project Dastan's doing, to get their stories featured, to get their stories actually taken to them. So, what is the process for that? How can they reach out to you?
You can just message us on Instagram. So or you can email us. That's probably the easiest.
All right, perfect. And so, also, guys, for everyone that's listening, Project Dastan also has a campaign. The link for that can be found on their website, and I'm assuming on their Instagram also. So, Sparsh Jayo, could you just give a little bit of insight on what the program is, how you're approaching it, and the goals from that?
But if anyone wants to contribute, we do have a donations platform open. So you can just message
Hmm.
us and we will send you the link. That's not.
All right, guys. So that's all that we have here with Sparsh Ahuja, the founder of Project Dastaan, and Jayosmita Ganguly, the lead of Project Dastaan in West Bengal. We hope you guys had a good time listening to their stories, listening to the stories that they've heard, and obviously stories that Manan and I share with you guys every week. If there's anything else that you would like us to cover regarding Project Dastan, if there's anything else that you would want to ask, you could reach out to them on their Instagram pages. We'll be tagging them on all our posts, and just let us know what you thought of the episode, what you liked, what you didn't like, whether you thought we missed out on something or if something else needed to be added. And we'll be back with more episodes sooner than you expect. And just thank you guys for listening and joining me. Thanks, Parsh. Thank you, Jayo.